This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. My guest today is Alexandra Iljadica. She is an investor with BHP Ventures, the venture capital arm of BHP, an Australian-based metal mining company. She has experience working in venture capital, but it's not where you would have thought her career would have taken her a decade ago when she was the co-founder and CEO of a youth-focused nonprofit in Australia. I met Alexandra when I moderated a panel on venture investing in the clean tech and sustainability space earlier this year. And I wanted to have her on the show, not only to talk about her experience as an investor, but also a little bit about her career path to getting there. Alexandra, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thanks, Gregory, for having me.
So as I alluded to in that introduction, currently you're working as an investor in a venture capital arm of a large company, and you've had some previous experience in venture, also interesting experience starting the 5G Innovation Lab at T-Mobile. But tell us how you went from working in a nonprofit that you founded and were the chief executive officer of to getting into investing.
It was a long path of realizing that the way that money moves around the world reflects the world that we have. So when I was running the Youth Food Movement, the nonprofit that I started while I was at university in Australia, I built programs around educating young Australians around the future of food. To do that, I raised money from philanthropists, I got government grants, and in my conversations with the philanthropists, I could see that, the decisions that they were making were really interesting to me. They were talking to me and giving me funding because I was having impact on food systems, but they were also talking to other people who were working around social justice issues or immigration issues. And I thought, that's really interesting. I'd like to do that. I'd like to head a little further upstream. And so when I decided to hand over the reins of CEO of my nonprofit, move on to the board and take a year off before deciding what next, I spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what part of the world of finance could I go into? Of course, philanthropy makes sense because it was really the other side of the table to what I was already at. But then looking at the size of the pie of, the amount of money that goes to philanthropy versus just conventional investing, it was a pittance. So I thought, well, how do I influence conventional capital flows? And I thought, could I be a day trader? Could I help, impact investing or some, ETF funds that are focused on women's empowerment or some of the, social issues that I cared about? And then I realized that was going to be a pretty long path. And I eventually landed on, well, early stage investing is very similar to the world that I had come from. So when I moved to the US, I started meeting people who were doing early stage investing and ended up landing a role with an early stage VC firm here called Quake Capital. Long story short, that firm struggled to raise their third fund, which would have opened the Seattle office, which is what I was recruited to do. And so my boss at the time, Jim Brisamitis, a wonderful man, we decided to continue working on the thesis that he had been developing around the future of telecommunications. And so we ended up starting the 5G Open Innovation Lab. That really led to me understanding how tech ecosystems work and how, there are many players involved in tech sales. So, for example, when you're using your application online, it's spinning the Azure meter, but that's, also because they've purchased some Intel servers and they're using some VMware software. And so I could see how one sale actually affected multiple sales. And I thought that was quite interesting and something that could certainly be applied to the sustainability sector because, the environment is so interconnected. So once I had enough time, understanding the tech sector, I ended up meeting a woman, Bridget O'Brien, who was heading up the team at BHP Ventures. And she said, look, I'm building out a team. Would you be interested? I actually recommended a few friends for the position that she was hiring because I wasn't looking for a new job. I was really satisfied at the lab. And then I went home and thought, you know what, actually, moving back into sustainability is what I really care about. I think this is probably a really interesting opportunity, although I never thought I would work for a mining company. And, we had a long conversation and a couple of conversations, and then eventually I moved over.
I'm going to come back to this idea of a mining company being the source of venture capital for innovative sustainability companies. But I want to go back to your transitions professionally. It really seems like the relationships that you built were key to these opportunities. There was no job posting for the Open Innovation Lab, 5G Open Innovation Lab. The offer to go to BHP Ventures that came out of a meeting that you had, not a listed job that you saw someplace. So can you maybe talk a little bit about your attitude towards or technique for the kind of networking and relationship building that has led to these opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. So when I first moved to the US, I did do the job board thing. I wanted to work at the Gates Foundation, and I applied to any and every job that, I thought I was qualified for. And I don't know, for me, it's only I can only do that for so long. And then I started meeting with other people who had, recently moved into jobs and asked them for their advice. And they said, look, I spend roughly 20% of my time on job boards and 80% of my time meeting people. And I was recommended this great book called The 20-Minute Networking Meeting. It's just a framework for having a very efficient conversation with someone. And the purpose is not landing a job from that conversation. The purpose is, can you introduce me to one or two more interesting people? And then you snowball from there. And then, statistically, roughly the sixth connection that you meet or the sixth snowball is likely to lead to a job. I did that as well because, I really like meeting people. And so I was new to Seattle and I had a small group of friends, but not many. So it was a chance to meet interesting people. And look, not all those meetings go well. Sometimes you meet people and either they're having a bad day or you just don't really connect or you don't gel or what they do is not what you thought they did. I would say maybe 70% of the meetings went really well. And by well, I mean they introduced me to someone else that was equally interesting. And that's eventually how I met Jim, so who got my first job. And then Bridget, I was hosting a Women in VC event, which I host quarterly here in Seattle, the Women in VC Happy Hour. And she was there. I think, my early days running my nonprofit, I'm a natural community organizer, community builder. It was kind of a reflection of that. But yeah.
So 2 strategies. One is really an outbound strategy of meeting with people. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on that. And the second is more inbound, putting yourself at the center of a network where you're inviting people to an event and that becomes an attractant. Then more people come in and you meet people. So I think those are both fantastic strategies. We talk to students about these as well. They're organizing events on campus. They can invite people, and that's a great way to expand their networks. When you're doing that outreach during that period of the 20-minute networking meeting strategy, what was the response rate that you got to your requests for meetings?
It was pretty high. I mean, I believe in the theory around having a trusted inviter. So if the introduction came from someone that person also trusted, then they were likely to say yes. I met with these people often once, so it wasn't much, and the request is, hey, 20 minutes and I'll come to you at a time that makes sense. I had all the free time because I wasn't working. So yeah, just trying to make it as low barrier to entry for the person that you want to meet as possible. And then honestly, and the 20-minute network meeting really covers this, like I would go into each meeting with 3 questions because I think that's enough. You needed a little bit of time of, here is who I am and this is why I want to talk to you. 3 questions I found was good because, and they were very thoughtful questions that were specific that I couldn't, find an answer to on Google or something like that. And then you leave a little bit of space to have an open conversation. And sometimes the meetings would go longer than 20 minutes. Sometimes they would, be cut off and off the person went. Yeah, the homework and the preparation is as important as, the meeting itself. And I would also say, the people that I really wanted to meet or the organizations that I really wanted to connect with, I didn't meet them first. I wanted to get like 5 or 6 of these 20-minute fresh stranger meetings under my belt so that I could refine my spiel, get it down to a couple of minutes. Because when I first started, I would speak in way too much detail. I would give too much backstory and, really just like, what are the headlines to get someone interested? And you need to tweak it per person so that it's relevant to them.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You were sort of triangulating in on your real target with these other connections, as well as getting a few reps under your belt with lower value targets, if you will. We tell students sometimes to do that if you're at a career fair. Don't go to your top choice company first. Like shag a couple balls, with the other companies that are not at the top of your list so that you get a warm up.
Yeah, definitely. And then the follow-up is really important. Not just saying like, thank you for your time, but, you said you were going to introduce me to X, Y, and Z people. And then when you do meet those people, saying thank you to that initial inviter. Thank you so much. I had a great conversation with them. It's just all about building that relationship because you don't know where things might lead. You may come up in their mind a couple of months down the track when they do hear about a job opportunity. So I think it's really just about, the homework the follow-up is also equally important.
Great reminder there for my listeners. So you get your opportunities through these relationships, and now you're doing the job. What, from your background, from your previous experience, from building that nonprofit and running that nonprofit, what are some of the skills that were most transferable to your later success in venture capital or at the Open Innovation Lab?
Well, that's a good question. When you're running a nonprofit or when you're running a startup or a small business, you have to wear all the hats. And because of that, you have to be incredibly organized and you have to have a meticulous, prioritized to-do list. And I think that's something that I've taken through with all of my jobs. I use the priority matrix, which is like urgent versus important. And so I have 4 Post-it notes in my notebook and I put things in there based on whether they're urgent and important or, not. And, because you can't get to everything. When you're running a nonprofit, when you're running your own company, you can't get to it all. And so there are lots of things that you intend to do, but if they stay in that 4th quadrant that is not urgent and not important, you're not going to get them done. So that's certainly one thing I took forward. I mean, networking, what else? I would say a curiosity about how things work and trying to understand the KPIs or the motivations of the person that I'm meeting. When I was running my nonprofit, I was often asking for partnerships or funding or free resources of some kind. And so I had to understand, okay, I'm meeting with someone from a local government department who supports youth programs. Great. What are their KPIs? Do they have numbers around certain audience size? Does it have to be a particular age? Does it have to be particular social issues? And then you're really trying to tweak what you do to see if it meets their needs. I would never, make something up. I would never say my program's actually about supporting migrants and refugees when actually it's not, because that's what their KPI was. But really, you're trying to speak their language as much as possible. And I find myself doing that in my job today where I'm talking to deeply technical founders or deeply technical people across BHP who are geologists and other scientific disciplines. And I'm trying to explain to them, hey, there's this emerging technology. This is roughly what they do, but I'm trying to talk it in a language that they understand because they don't get the language of venture capital and they don't get the language of startups, but they do understand, different rock formations and carbon drawdown potential of different rock types and things like that. So I think trying to talk your audience's language is a really big skill that I've brought forward.
Absolutely. We always tell that to students. You want to speak in the language of the person you're speaking to, using the kind of language that they're familiar with, tailoring your experience to the kinds of work that they're doing, all obviously while being accurate and not creating stories where there aren't any. So you mentioned working with highly technical people, geologists, engineers. How do you get up to speed quickly on the technologies that you're learning about?
I read a lot. I watch videos on YouTube. And then when I eventually meet with someone, I try and replay what they say and have them validate that I've heard them correctly. So if I'm meeting a direct air capture company or I'm talking to our carbon desk or our carbon removal team about different approaches to direct air capture, which is sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, if they say, oh, this is a solvent-based approach and it's a modular approach so we can move the units around, I would essentially rephrase that to make sure that I've understood it correctly, but also take it a little bit further and say, and that's important because, we need to be able to move the stream of CO2 around our asset or our mine site, for example. So yeah, I think just like replaying.
That sounds like an active listening technique. So I think that's great. So tell us a little bit, let's shift gears. So you're working for a mining company and you're taking what I presume are the profits of the mining of copper and nickel and all these other metals that are key to the electrification of our societies, right? And you're taking those profits and you're making bets on new technologies that have I guess we would say, a positive impact on the future climate on the planet, a negative impact on the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere, hopefully. Tell us just a little bit about how you evaluate some of these companies. And then I'd love to hear your insights. We're recording this in August. We're recording this in July of 2023. Heat waves sweeping the globe, but also record amounts of investment from the US government, as well as a lot of other governments, in new technologies, in electrification, in solar, wind, and et cetera, direct air capture and other types of carbon sequestration. There's headlines every day, it seems like, about new nuclear technologies. So what do you see in your on the horizon for you? What are the technologies that are most interesting? And if you were advising somebody who's looking to get into this space, where would you maybe point them?
Yeah, okay. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
So let's just back up a little bit and maybe state what's obvious to me, but maybe not so obvious to everyone else. But why would mining want to invest in climate technology? I mean, first off, mining is, like you say, going to provide all the raw materials for the energy transition. We don't yet today have enough of these raw materials in circulation and the technology to recycle all of the metals that we need to stop mining. So mining will be needed in the future for the energy transition, to provide electric vehicle batteries, to provide the infrastructure, the steel for direct air capture or hydrogen plants or whatever it might be. So we still need to mine. The challenge with mining today is that we need to do it with less emissions. So certainly we can add carbon capture, point source carbon capture, and remove the carbon dioxide that is being produced today. We can use techniques that are lower energy. We can have renewable energy sources. Most major ore bodies that are within, say, 300 meters of the Earth's surface have been discovered. And so we're having to dig even deeper to get these raw materials, which means you take more energy. The rock is getting far harder, so that takes more energy to dig that rock. And then the concentration or the grade of that ore may also be less, because often when you start mining, you start at the point where the deposit is most concentrated. And so you need to process that even more just to get the amount that you were previously getting. So it's a really wicked problem that mining faces in terms of providing those raw materials. And then, that doesn't even mention all of the ethical labor standards that, we also need to continue to adhere to. The reason the BHP Ventures was stood up is really to provide BHP options as it navigates this energy transition. So we invest on 4 pillars. The first is, how do we decarbonize our current operations? We look at long duration energy storage. So might be batteries, it might be gravity-based storage systems that provide us with an energy source that is non-intermittent and is for roughly, say, a 12 to 24-hour period. We also look at alternate fuels, such as hydrogen and other fuel sources. The second part that we invest under is, how are we growing our resource base? So this looks at novel drilling techniques, novel extraction, like synthetic biology for extraction of metals from ore bodies. And we also look at tailings and circular economy around tailings. So tailings is the waste material that is produced when you mine any material. And there is still sometimes some resources in there, so you can either reprocess it to extract those metals, or you can repurpose it into something like a cementitious material or a part that goes in towards cement. The third area that we invest in is downstream demand to our commodities in the energy transition. So this looks at markets and technologies that are going to affect demand for the commodities that we produce. So we produce iron ore, which goes into steel making. We produce copper, nickel, potash, which is a precursor. It's like a pink rock that's a precursor to fertilizer. And then we have some coal. So both that goes for coal-fired power stations, which we continue to divest from, and then coal for steelmaking purposes. So we're looking at downstream markets that can affect demand for those things, such as battery recycling and battery chemistries. Nickel and copper are important parts of batteries. And so as either new chemistries come online or as recycling is stood up and materials, the secondary market of raw materials is coming online, how does that affect demand for our raw materials? Green steel is, of course, a really big part of that as well. And then we also look at software solutions in that space like traceability and emissions tracking. The fourth area of our thesis is future growth options for BHP, and that largely looks at our role in the carbon market. So, for example, the nickel that we produce, the waste rock from that, the chemistry of the rock actually naturally sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, which is incredible. So we're looking at technologies that can help us accelerate that process so it can draw down even more, but also ways that we can measure, so the monitoring and verification of how much carbon did we actually remove, can we create some offsets from that and enter the carbon market. And then we also look at some nuclear in that part of our portfolio as well. So when we meet companies, it's really how well do you fit into those buckets? And then also, is mining part of your customer set? Could we help you with a proof of concept, or could we help you with a commercial contract in some way? Now, that's certainly not a requirement. We're a big 80,000 person organization and we operate in 90 countries. And, there are many ways that we could work together, but that's not always the case. Some investments we make are really to understand where certain markets or technologies are heading, and they're just passive.
So to just clarify that, demonstrate my active listening. You're saying you evaluate a company and you're on one hand evaluating, should we invest in this company? And then you're also saying, is there a way that we can support this company with our business by signing a contract with them to buy their technology or to deliver them some of your waste product, which is their feedstock or something like that. So there can be an investment relationship, but then also this business partner relationship.
Yeah, and it's really case by case, and I wouldn't say we do that for all, and it depends on the stage of the company. Right. I mean, you've probably seen this. It's really hard for early stage startups to work with large corporations. It's really those startups in our portfolio that are later stage. Some startups, for example, it's less about a commercial contract and it's actually more about product development. So we provide them with ores so that they can test their leaching technology using our grade ores. Or for our green steel investments, providing them samples of our iron ore of different grades so that they can test their particular approach to making green steel using our grade ores. So, and that helps them refine their product because they're seeing how their technology responds to different types of ores. And when I say that, I mean, if you take some iron ore rock, the amount of iron in that red rock, it changes. So it could be like a 58%, it could be a 62%. And so, what your technology does, it has to respond. Because at the end of the day, you want to concentrate it as much as possible so that you can make steel.
And with these 4 pillars or buckets that you identified of the kind of companies and technologies that you're looking at, this sounds like really hard tech, and in some cases, really deep tech. Not a ton of software. I mean, maybe in some of the tracking of and accounting for carbon, there's a software piece of it. Are these companies, I mean, they must be led by really smart scientist type people. But since I'm from the business school here and thinking about my students and their goals, do companies like that have the need for MBA type talent when they're in this still fundraising stage, when they're early?
Yes. I mean, all companies need capital and customers. And so if your students can support in fundraising activities, and what that looks like is organizing a bunch of meetings, managing a pipeline, looking at a list of potential investors, finding warm introductions, writing, emails that are convincing, facilitating, meetings that move things forward. I think, supporting on fundraising is one area that I see MBA students certainly step into. Kind of related to that is the second piece around needing customers. And so whether it's, we have an early sales strategy, a lot of early startup sales is actually more like BD, especially in my world, because they're big infrastructure contracts. And so can you offtake hydrogen? Can you negotiate an offtake for carbon dioxide? So if you're comfortable with contracts, if you're comfortable with relationship-based sales processes where you really need to spend a long time building a relationship, understanding the customer's problems, and whether what you're doing is actually going to solve that, I see a lot of MBA students step into that space as well.
So business development, sales, customer and market research, and fundraising are for early stage startups in this hard tech, science-y tech space are the kind of things that you see. And I presume no science engineering background, just that curiosity that you said has contributed a lot to your success, the ability to learn about these technologies, and the ability to really get out there and network and find that product market fit, essentially, for these companies where they know they have like good science, they're onto something, but their expertise doesn't necessarily lie in making the business case.
Definitely. And technical people will see, often these companies are started by a technical founder. And then at some stage, their skills on either sales or relationship development or strategy are limited, and they need to step aside and bring in a CEO that is more experienced on that front. Maybe they're an industry veteran. Maybe they've been involved in commercializing startups or commercializing products, startup type products before. And it's very common that a technical founder will need to step aside for someone with kind of that more commercial experience.
So this part of our conversation started with a very long and sprawling question of mine, which was perhaps not as concise as it should have been, but where I think the piece that we haven't really addressed is, what do you see as some of the most promising areas right now? Obviously, you've got these 4 pillars, things that you're looking at. Some of them are more long-term, some of them are more near-term. What's most promising for the next, say, 3 to 5 years, do you think?
I've been spending a lot of time looking at battery recycling and battery chemistries. We look at the growth of EVs as predicting demand for some of the commodities that we produce, so the nickel and the copper. But of course, everything needs to be electrified. It's just that passenger vehicles are the first thing to go. So I've been spending a lot of time trying to understand the different business models around ownership of those. Some of the areas I've been focused on, battery recycling and battery chemistries. There's a lot of change going on in that space right now, not just on the technology front. So how are we going to recycle these materials in a way that has lower emissions, less energy, is a quicker process? So there are ways that you can, when you crush a battery, you turn it into black mass. You can essentially extract the metals from that. Conventional processes mean that you do that. It's quite a long process, and you get individual metal salts at the end. There are some new technologies coming out where instead of removing all of those individual metals, you actually remove all the impurities. So you get rid of the iron, you get rid of the aluminum, you get rid of the copper, and then what you're left with are the metals that matter. So that's quite interesting. There are also some approaches to, you get the battery scrap and you essentially upgrade it so that it can be reused. So instead of going through the full recycling process, you bring it up to scratch so that it could go back into a battery. So I think that is really interesting. On the business model side of that market, I'm so curious around who's going to own these batteries, not just at their end of life, but just how, leases are being structured and how that changes demand for the raw materials that we're all going to need going forward. So I think that's really an evolving space.
On a smaller scale, we're seeing battery swapping, right, in lighter vehicles, in scooters and bikes, where the user doesn't even own the battery. They subscribe to the battery as a service, essentially.
Yeah, it's really, especially in like 2-3-wheeler vehicles, that's very common. And in many parts of Asia, they've been doing that for a number of years. And then the battery chemistry side is really interesting as well. I mean, it's taken a long time for lithium-ion batteries to become the dominant chemistry, but there are different chemistries around both the cathode. We're now changing chemistry of the anode. I think there's a lot of people also looking at solid state and changes to battery electrolytes. And so it's really, it's how well can you scale manufacturing of these chemistries? There's a lot that you can do on a small lab scale, but actually how do you stand that up is a whole other question. And so normally that comes down to how well you can fundraise and what bits you're actually going to manufacture in to make sure it's cost competitive to what else is on the market. So green steel is the other area that I'm so curious about. I don't know if you've seen, there's a great infographic of all of the metals that are produced, and you've got piles and piles and piles of iron. I don't know if it's iron or if it's steel. I think it's iron in the graphic. And then you've got all the other elements. So like the amount of copper and the nickel and the lithium and the cobalt and all of these other things that are produced minuscule in comparison to the amount of steel that we produce. And so if you're going to decarbonize anything, that is an area to focus on. And there is a lot of work going on. There are kind of two approaches. You can either use hydrogen as a fuel source in the steelmaking process, or you can capture carbon dioxide off the conventional processes, or you can use electrolysis-based approaches. So that's where you're essentially melting down iron into steel in one step, or there are different ways to go about it. But I think, and you're using renewable energy as a energy source. So I think that's incredibly interesting, very compelling. And maybe it's because I'm Australian and we produce a lot of iron ore, not just BHP, but there are a lot of other mining companies that do that. So it's, important part for Australia's future growth.
And not a lot of great substitutes for steel in the economy. Obviously, I'm sitting in a building that's a mass timber building. You had the chance to see it, but mass timber is great for buildings, perhaps not so great for a lot of other things that we need steel for. That is
exactly.
Definitely
and
something that we need to clean up.
There are some companies that are creating materials that are comparable to steel, but it's a problem of scale. Like the volumes of steel that we consume are just so great that most people, you can't even fathom it.
And, when you were talking about your 4 pillars, you mentioned based energy storage or kinetic storage of energy. Are there interesting innovations going on here? Because, this is in some ways some of the most ancient batteries were kinetic batteries, where either you're pushing something up a hill so you can let it roll back down later, or pumping water into an upper reservoir, raising something. I've seen these ones where it's like cranes that are just raising concrete blocks up. Are there interesting innovations going on there? Do you think that that's a place where we could see some real growth in terms of evening out the supply side of renewables like wind and solar that are intermittent?
Yeah, I'm seeing that most of it is the intermittency problem is being solved mostly by batteries today, and it will probably in the near term still be solved by batteries and different, chemistries in different forms. Gravity is interesting from a mining perspective because some of the companies that we've seen are either using open pit mines, so these are mines that are just like a big hole in the ground that you can see, or they're using underground mines. So these are big, long mine shafts, and they're essentially using the depth of the mine shaft as part of the gravity system, and then using some of our waste rock as the weighted material that is traveling through that system. So interesting. It all comes down to the levelized cost of energy, and can it be competitive with either batteries or whatever else is out there. The other one that is interesting in this space is geothermal. So we have a couple of investments in this space as well. Not conventional geothermal that really needs an aquifer for it to work properly. The companies that we're looking at and that we've invested in have specific technologies, whether it's drilling technology or the way that they structure their operation is in kind of setting up loops underground so that the water can kind of travel and again provide consistent supply of energy, but also heat as well if needed. So I think geothermal certainly still has a way to go, but I think it has some legs.
I remember a few years ago attending a conference where there was someone talking about essentially mine mouth coal power plants and converting those into geothermal plants, because all the infrastructure is there and you typically have heat when you get down to where that mine was going. So you can drill a bunch of wells, and instead of pulling coal out of the ground and burning it in the plant to spin turbines, you can concentrate the heat that's coming out and turn that into energy. And it all connects to existing grid infrastructure, which is oftentimes one of the problems. What we're seeing in the United States, obviously, is you have essentially stranded renewable projects because we don't have the transmission lines to get, if we build that wind farm or that solar plant, there isn't the power grid to connect it up. And it takes a long time to get those permits to build the transmission lines.
Yeah. That's certainly something that I mentioned before. We have our coal that we mine for coal-fired power stations, and we're continuing to divest from those or close those operations. And I know that the decision to close an operation always comes with considerations around, there's great infrastructure there. How can we use that for renewables or other purposes? So it's a much more complex discussion.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure.
Not certainly something that my team looks at in any way, but I know it's something that we strongly consider.
So we're coming to the end of our time. I always like to ask a couple final questions. And I think where I'll start is, if there's one piece of advice that you would give to a job seeker looking to get into what we could broadly refer to as climate tech, what would that advice be?
Climate touches everything. Do not compromise on what it is what specific part of climate that you care about. If you really care about food and agriculture, look at companies in that space. If you really care about water systems, go focus on that. If you really care about industrialization and bringing hydrogen to market sooner, go and focus on that. There are so many companies in each of these spaces. The second thing I would recommend is look at a company's funding history. How well capitalized are they? Did they recently raise a round, and so they've got enough cash to get them through for another year or so? And so if you get a job there, you're going to have a job at least for a year or two. We're in a really interesting time. Climate tech investing has certainly not slowed as much as the software investing has slowed, and the tech sector broadly has slowed in the current downturn. But I would say things are still, things are certainly softening. So I would, there are some companies that, I met with a year or two ago have now shut down. That's always normal. But I think if you're going to spend the time and effort to get into a company to begin with, and then invest your time and energy and your expertise in trying to make that company successful, you want to make sure that they've also done their homework and been able to provide you with the resources that you need to do what you need to do.
Are there publications, websites, podcasts, or books that you would recommend to someone looking to work in this space?
My climate journey is great. I mean, when I first started, and even before I took the job at BHP Ventures, I would always consume that just to learn about the different areas of climate. I feel like they do a great job of covering all the great startups, but also speaking to experts around government funding and people who are on the front lines building these big plants. And there are a couple of good YouTube channels that I follow for specific areas. Can't remember them right now, but I'll share them with you.
And I'll be sure to put them and all the other resources we've mentioned in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com.
Excellent, thanks.
Any final thoughts?
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just really encouraged by anyone who wants to move into climate. I think there is so much work to be done. We need a lot of smart people moving into this space. And so I encourage all of your students to consider it, even those that, hadn't traditionally thought about working in climate.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra, for taking the time to have this conversation on careers and professional life.
Thank you, Gregory.
Alexandra's insights provide a unique perspective on transitioning from a nonprofit background to a role in venture capital, driven by her realization that the movement of money around the world shapes our reality. I've worked with many students who've had a similar realization, that if they want to have impact at scale, doing so through business is the way to go. She emphasized the importance of strategic networking, building relationships for her career pivot. Alexandra's use of the 20-minute networking meeting played a key role in her career shifts, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Often when I work with students coming from a nonprofit background, they're concerned with how to talk about their experience in the context of business. Alexandra talked about how her experience running a nonprofit helped her develop skills like multitasking, organization, and understanding diverse motivations and KPIs. These skills have been transferable to her later roles. Always look for ways to explain your transferable skills from past jobs to your future career choice. And last, Alexandra encouraged job seekers in climate tech to focus on areas they're passionate about and to research a company's funding history to ensure its stability. She suggests considering roles in fundraising, business development, sales, and customer research, as these are crucial for startups. Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com. This episode was produced with editing and engineering support from Amelia Nguyen, a student in the Communication Leadership Master's Program at the University of Washington, and made possible in part with funding from Snowcap, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Learn more at snowcap.vc. That's SNOCAP.vc.